How are you, by the way?
I'm walking down Annunciation Street. I was sitting on the patio of this little coffee shop, but kind of loud, so I'm going to walk down here where I can get out of the noise and talk to you guys for a minute. How's it going?
You couldn't tell them that you were doing something very important.
We're missing you, Jason. But glad you're having fun.
I would love to say I'm missing y'all.
I know.
Is it wrong that we have a mannequin of you in the third chair over here?
Oh, I want to see a picture of that.
Yeah, we'll take a picture of that.
What's happening, man? I got a text from Jason last night, and he says, "Man, I wish I could read it right now, but I can't pull it up. It's I have got a creepy story for you."
Yeah.
You got a lot to live up to because I've been
Yeah,
talking about
we've
it
been
all
pumping
morning.
it up.
Well, it's a this city's a weird place. You run into people that you hadn't seen in years, or you run into old friends or whatever. And got down here a few days ago and was walking into Lucy's, which is just within a bike ride of here. And a friend of mine I knew in Tupelo, his name's Andy Aikenson. Used to live down here. I knew him when I lived in Tupelo. He lived there. He's originally from Minnesota. Anyhow, he's back down here. And ran into him and got to talking, and I got to talking about the radio show, and he said, well, you need to tell them my story about my experience up in Michigan years ago when I was selling books door to door. And I had forgotten all about it when we were talking about the ghost stuff last week. And so I got him to retell it. And he had a few too many, otherwise the language would have been perfect. I would have recorded it, but you couldn't have broadcasted the way he told it. But and then I got with him yesterday. I was going to call him and get him to do it when he was more lucid, but he's already headed back to Minnesota. He spends the summers in Minnesota and spends the winters down here in New Orleans.
Smart.
But anyways, I'll try to tell it as quickly as I can, but it is a pretty long story. Andy was selling books door to door after his freshman year. He had flunked out of a little private college up there in Michigan, and so his dad made him get this job selling books door to door, and I think it was encyclopedias. And so he'd just go knock on doors and give them his sales pitch, and he's a salesman. He's in the car business, and he could sell, an ice maker to a Eskimo.
Right.
Anyhow, he's driving. He said there's a lot of farmland in Michigan. A lot of people don't realize that it almost reminds you of the Mississippi Delta, just really flat, really desolate. And he was going down this highway, this country 2-lane highway, and he said there's this beautiful little white farmhouse off the road. And he said, well, it looks like, a nice place, and I'm going to pull in there and try to sell some books. So he turns down this dirt driveway, and he said the driveway is about a quarter of a mile long, and he pulls up to this old, beautiful, white, flatboard farmhouse. He said flowers in the front yard, and it's early summer, and he said just real welcoming and homey feeling. So he walks up, and he said there's a breezeway between the main house and the garage that had a door. So he said he walked up these steps, and he said there's potted plants going up the steps to this breezeway, and he knocks on the screen door, and nobody comes to the door. So, he said they're country, nice people. He said probably not thinking anybody is going to do anything harmful. So he said I just walked on into the breezeway and made it to the big door that went into the big main house. Knocked on the door. He said I can see through the window in the door into the kitchen, and he said it's, beautifully painted, bright yellow kitchen with, dishes displayed above the counter, and he said I could smell bacon cooking, and so he knocked on the door. He said this little old lady comes to the door and opens it, and he gives her his, my name's Andy, I'm selling books, blah, blah, blah. So she said, sure, my granddaughter's visiting for the summer, and she might be interested, and if she is, I'll buy them for her. And so he goes in the house, he sits down at this big country table in the kitchen, and she's making breakfast. And so he says she makes me breakfast, and toast and eggs and bacon and everything. And So the granddaughter, she calls her down from upstairs, and she's high school age, and comes down. So he has his pamphlet, and, you know, it's one of those deals where you sell and they place an order, and then you come back and deliver like a month or two later. And so he said they're sitting there talking, and he's eating, and this lady, she looks at him, and she has this troubled look on her face. And she takes off her apron and takes, you know, wipes her hands and sits across from the table and says, Andy, I have a strong urge to just pray for you right now. And you just have to know Andy, he said, okay, you know, whatever you want to do. He's just trying to sell these encyclopedias, you know.
Right.
So she takes his hands across the table, and he says she starts praying out loud. And the granddaughter grabs his hands, and they start praying. And he said it ends up going into this language that he doesn't understand, which he said must have just been they were speaking in tongues or something. And he said, I'm just kind of not necessarily uncomfortable, but he said I didn't know what was going on. And he said the weird thing about it, he said their hands, he said they got red hot as they were praying. And he said his skin began to burn, and not physically burn, but he said, you know, their hands, he said it was like sticking your hand on a hot plate. And he said their hands just got hotter and hotter and hotter. And then when he couldn't take it anymore, they quit praying and let go of it. And he said they acted like it was normal, you know, and he said, I didn't bring it up as far as it being weird or anything. I'm trying to sell books. And he said, I finished my breakfast, and, you know, they all went back to being hospitable and everything. And so she ends up ordering all of his books. Every book that he offered, they order, and she pays in full, which he said was very normal. And he said she had these real piercing blue eyes, and he said it was almost like she was staring through me the whole time I was there. And so they hug him. She gives him cookies to take on the road with him and sends him on his way. Well, he said he's driving down out from the house, and he looks in the rearview mirror, and, you know, it's a long, straight gravel driveway, and they're waving to him in the rearview mirror. And he said, normally, you know, these country roads, he said, you don't look when you pull out somewhere, because he said you don't see a car every 20 minutes or something. Then he said, you know, I normally just whip out of a driveway, hit the highway, pull in the next one. And he said, for some reason, he said, I was just sitting there thinking, golly, that was a weird experience. So I never really had anybody pray for me out loud, holding my hands, you know, their hands get red hot. So he said he stopped the car at the end of the driveway. And he said, I'll never forget, I was sitting right next to this beautifully painted mailbox, you know, flowers around the edge of it. And he said, I look up, and there's a big truck, 18-wheeler. He said it had to be doing 80 miles an hour, just screaming down the highway. And he said if I hadn't have stopped to think about what just happened, I would have been just obliterated by this truck, just smashed into smithereens. And so he said, you know, that was kind of the first weird thing that I remember after the prayer thing, the prayer incident. He said, I normally would never have stopped at the end of that driveway, but because of what happened, it stopped. I stopped, you know, it made me think, wow, that was really weird. I see him waving to me in the background. And so I did come to a stop, and he said, if I hadn't, I'd been dead. Just no question about it. This truck would have gone right over my little Ford Taurus, and I'd been smashed and dead. So he said that was really weird. And then he said he's making it up to the next town, and a very similar thing happened. He said there was a blind curve where some railroad tracks were. He said there's railroad tracks all over northern Michigan, or wherever in Michigan. And he said normally you just go right over them. You know, there's no blinking lights, there's no things that come down to keep your car from going across out in the middle of the country. And he said I came around this curve, and I see these tracks, and I stopped. For some reason, he said, I just stopped. And I've been over tracks 1,000 times and never come to a complete stop. And he looks down, and here comes a freight train barreling down the tracks. And he said, something just told me I needed to come to a complete stop. And if he hadn't, the train would have just smashed killed him, gone right over his little car. Anyhow, he said, you know, that doesn't sound too weird. And he said that, you know, you have these experiences where you go, well, if I had stepped off the curb, that bus would have hit me, but I didn't for some reason. It's, you know, you can't explain it. Anyhow, he gets his books in a couple of months later, and he said they give him this truck to drive, and he goes and delivers all his books that he sold the month before. And he makes his way around different towns, and he finally gets out to this area in Michigan to deliver. I can't remember her name, but he remembers her name, and this has been almost 20 years ago, to deliver the books. And he turns down the driveway. The mailbox is smashed over, no flowers. Drives up to the house. Said there's no flowers in the flower beds. You know, everything's very unkempt looking, no lights on. Knocks on the breezeway door that goes, the breezeway that goes between the garage and the main house. Of course, nobody answers, just like last time, so he goes in the screen door and goes to the main door and knocks on the big oak door. And he looks in the window, and he said, there's nothing in there. He said, there's one old farm table in the kitchen. He said, there's no doors on the cabinets. Everything's just in disarray. He said, there's cobwebs everywhere. There's dust an inch thick on the counters. He said, it looks like this house has been abandoned for 100 years. There's no furniture in the house, just no paint on the walls. He said everything was down to the bare wood, you know, stuff falling down. The mantle had fallen off the fireplace, where the fireplace is. And he said he just started getting really weirded out. He walked around, didn't look like anybody had been there forever. And so he drove down to the next house and told the lady that lived, you know, a mile or two down the road. Asked her what happened to Mrs. So-and-so, and that lady, she said, I don't know who you're talking about. She said the family that lived in that house has been dead for 50 years. Nobody's lived in that house for 50 or 60 years. And
You got me?
I'm not done.
No.
Please.
So the way that he kept track of where he lived, I mean, where he had to deliver books, was he had a map, like a Rand McNally map, and he would just, you know, mark spaces on the map with a magic marker, and that's where he was supposed to go. And then he had his order invoices where he would write the name and the address and the phone numbers and what books they ordered and all that stuff. So he said, I didn't know what to do. You know, he said, this lady must have been wrong. And he said, I knew where I'd been, and I had the books in my truck with me. So he said, I just left a note. Mrs. Lipinski, or whatever her name was, I hope these books find you. You know, and he said, I left them in that breezeway. So when he got back and he was reconciling all his invoices and his checks and everything, he could not find the invoice that he wrote when they ordered those books. And he said there were no pages missing from his invoice book. It went like 59, 60, 61, 62, you know, everything was sequential. And he didn't have the page where he had written her name and the order and the address and all of that stuff. It's like it never even happened. And he said the check cleared. He contacted the bank. They had no record of anything. It's just no explanation for a lot of this stuff.
Wow.
Check cleared?
Well, because my thought was, did they pay cash? Because you
No,
would
he
go
said
back
the
and try
check-
to find the check to prove that it happened.
They cleared
So the
it.
money,
Check cleared.
the money went in his account, but then there's no record of it, right?
That's right. And when he contacted the bank, and he said he and his dad have paid, you know, you can get online and go to these search engines and pay money to find people, you know, like private investigators use. And he said this lady evidently never existed. He said, I have her name. I've tried every spelling of it.
Wow.
I've looked. I've paid money to look for her. And he said every city I go to, he travels a lot. He said every city I go to, I look it up, you know, when I get there to see if this lady exists. And there's no record of her ever.
Ooh,
And he ate her cooking.
He has special purpose.
he did. He
Yeah, I mean, he can't explain, he's not a religious person, but he said, you know, that's the only